good morning. A warm welcome to the Humanist Community in Silicon Valley Sunday Forum to those joining us this morning. My name is Ray Sunby, President of the Humanist Community. The Humanist Community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a secular and reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist Community if you have not yet done so. A special welcome to those who are with us for the first time. We invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. We also welcome ACSJ, the Atheist Community in Silicon Valley, and one of their members will present our forum this morning. That'll be announced. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist Community. Membership forms, a list of upcoming events, information about donating to the Humanist Community, and other information can be found on our website, www.humanists.org.
All right. Good morning. I'm Alex Havasi. I'm Vice President of the Humanist Community. This Sunday, Werner Haag will discuss the history of atheism, a view that goes further back than the scientific revolutions of a few hundred years ago, and even before the famous Greek philosophers. Werner will take us on from ancient times in India, the dark ages of Christianity and Islam in Europe, the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment era, and neo-atheism of the 21st century. Werner Haag is the current president of ACSJ, the Atheist Community of San Jose, and has a Ph.D. in environmental chemistry. He's presented to scientific conferences as well as to atheist and humanist groups on topics such as the biological origins of morality and examples of real-time evolution. He's also a science director of the Humanist Global Charity. This is the organization that does such good work around the world that Hank Policia has spoken to us about. Werner.
Yeah. Hi. Well, thank you for the invitation. And as Alex said, this is a joint meeting with the Atheist Community of San Jose. So we do have some new members, and I would welcome you guys as well. Hi, here comes Thomas. We have essentially the same types of goals and features as Ray just mentioned for the humanist community in Silicon Valley, so there's no need to repeat them. I'd preface this by saying that I am not a historian, but I'll share my screen right now. Where are we here? Oh, here.
What's he talking about?
I was turned on to this book called Doubt by Jennifer Michael Hecht by one of our other members, Tom Higgins. And I wanted to read it through in detail after he gave a presentation on it. And so I've since added a few other sources of a book. Let me page down. Okay, why is it not going? So I've read some of these other sources or parts of them at least. To my surprise, there's back all the way back early in 1863, there's a summary of history of doubt by this fellow Adam Farrar, who went on a world tour and saw religions all over the world and realized that there are so many different options and variations that none of them can really be the be all and end all and represent the truth. Christopher Catherwood, I thought was an interesting book on making the war in the name of God, which is not so much about history, but mostly that aspect of religion. And then there's an actual journal called Atheism and Moral Progress, or a book here. So, oops, sorry, back up. Anyway, this talk is based mostly on Jennifer Michael Hecht's book, which overlaps these other books quite extensively. So it's mostly taken from her work. So I'm not the author, and I'll do the best I can to summarize this work. Help me out if you know more about a particular topic. I can't see. Can you guys see the title, the top? Let me see. Is this clear on the share? Okay, it's blocked out. I need to move this bar here. Anyway, a lot of the atheist writings have been destroyed, and so a lot of because religion was so ubiquitous and hated atheists, so they burned a lot of the books, and so much of the history, or often the history, comes from what's the religious stories or books that are sort of as a negative. In other words, the religious stories are fighting against atheism, and they argue against certain things that atheists talk about, and so we get sort of by a negative instead of a positive story. We get the information that there was atheist or non-religious influence going on at the time. So that's, unfortunately, we've lost a lot of information that way. I'm more of a scientist, and so I tend to be interested in mostly the earlier stuff from a anthropological point of view than from a historical point of view. This fellow, Tim Whitmarsh, wrote this book, Battling the Gods, and he argues in the beginning that the atheism is likely just as old as religion because of its paradoxical nature. So it asks you to accept things that aren't obviously there in your world. So how far back does religion go? Well, the oldest undisputed intentional Neanderthal burial was about 130,000 years ago. The oldest undisputed ritual human burial is about 100,000 years ago in Israel. Some people argue that Neanderthals didn't have the mental capacity for religion. That's whether that's true or not. This indicates that religious ideas started very long time ago, certainly before any religious texts were written. And if humans had the capacity to create gods in their mind, then they also must have had the capacity to negate them and decide that they don't exist, or argue whether they exist. And so my point would be that atheism is as old as religion is. There's not that someone thought of the idea of religion and then suddenly everyone had that same concept at the same time. So again, Whitmarsh makes this point, and I would agree with it. So this is our basis. Atheism is probably very, very old. The earliest recorded atheist ideas are from these early Indian doubters who claim that there's no benefits to good behavior or punishment for evil since there's no afterlife. But these guys weren't Puranika. Sapo claimed to be an all-knowing person, so he wasn't exactly completely an atheist himself. So they still followed some forms of religion, but this happens a lot in the early times where people still follow religions but are infusing them with atheist ideas. The Lakota doctrine of no God, spirits, or afterlife was espoused by the Carvanka in India as early as the 700s BCE. And then we get into the Greeks. And actually around the same time, Jainism and Buddhism start out as religions, as atheist religions, but later get infused with the idea of God sort of creeping in. So we just have the best historical records from the Greeks. So this is why I think most of this information comes from the European or Middle East area. Thales and Anaximandros describe the universal forces in terms of naturalism without reference to the gods. So there's no need for gods for explaining nature. What I've tried to do here is highlight the new concepts for sort of the first time I see them in brown. So the black highlights are important concepts, and the brown ones are the first ones, first time I've seen them. So it just gives you an idea of how far back this atheism ideas go. Now here's an interesting story. Daniel was a Jewish wise man. He debunks the claim of Cyrus the Great, who had a statue in Babylon of the god Bel or Marduk. And the claim was that the statue was alive, representing this god, because every day they made offerings of 20 sheep and 20 bushels of flour and 50 gallons of wine, and they'd disappear each night. And Daniel said, this is impossible. So he secretly left a fine dusting of ash in the temple floor. Sure enough, the next morning, there were human footprints heading up to these offerings, proving that the food was all eaten by the priests instead of the statue. So here we have one of the first examples of debunking of a religious claim. Again, around 500 BCE, Xenophanes of Colophon. This says he criticizes the Olympic gods and says they can't really exist because they always look like the different cultures that created them. Africans have their gods with black skin and flat noses, and the Thracians have blue eyes and red hair. And he says that if animals could draw, they would draw their gods in their own image. So, the zebra would probably have some kind of a zebra god. And thus, they're just created by the human mind. Heraclitus also mocks the Greek god pantheon. Diagoras of Melos was indicted because he made this claim that prayer doesn't work. People would bring him the evidence saying, well, look, here are all these people who were saved from dying in the shipwreck because they prayed to God. And he says, well, yeah, where are all the praying men who drowned in the shipwreck? Well, you can't hear from them because they're all in the bottom of the ocean. And him and Prodicus of Ceos were first notably labeled as atheists in the historical record, although I believe the Indians were also had the label. So anyway, it's early on. Democritus was the inventor of the atomic theory, or the basis that everything was made of atomic particles, and explains that religious experience are somehow just a manifestation of the movement of our atoms. So he couldn't, of course, understand the biochemistry, but he just felt that it was not sensible to have a separate human soul. Anaxagoras finds a meteorite, claims it was a hot rock, and this promotes the first laws against atheism. Socrates, I'm going to minimize some of my screen here, sorry. I have to, okay. In 399, Socrates given the poison hemlock famously after developing secular morality and teaching it. And Aristotle is an important figure because he influences religious and non-religious thinking for many hundreds of years up until the scientific revolution. He was a biologist, a linguist, and philosopher. So he went into all areas of science and taught that truth is arrived through rational inquiry and sensation, that no caring involved gods exist. But he was still religious in the sense that he thought that there must be some kind of a prime mover that moves the planets around and creates human desires. But later on, his thinking will be sort of the basis of atheism, especially through the period of Arab and Muslim Enlightenment in the around 1000 AD or 700 AD, that area. That's just the Anaxagoras finding the meteorite, claiming God the sun's a hot rock, which people didn't like to hear. Now we come to the Hellenistic age, where this was a time when these great empires like Rome and the Persians and Alexander the Great were bringing all sorts of people together, and they saw other religions and were sort of cosmopolitanized, and thus had to recognize that other religions had equal validity, and thus probably no validity. And so it it's particularly Euhemerus wrote this book called The Sacred Story, arguing that the gods were not really they were originally humans that were idolized and thus transformed into God. So this sort of uncertainties for many, where their original homes and the original religions are sort of mixed and people are moving around more, led to these so-called graceful life philosophies, the Cynics, the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Skeptics, who in various forms rejected religion. The Stoics said God is of an impersonal nature, so work hard, just conform to the flow, that you can't alter it anyway. So go with it as best you can. The Epicureans introduced this idea that do not fear gods, because there's no, you enjoy life as best you can. There's no need to fear. There's no afterlife, so no need to fear these gods. They may exist, but they don't affect civilization or planetary motion. And they were the first to define the problem of evil, of why there's so much evil in the world if there's a good God. And they noted that prayer is good to let off steam, but there's no listener, so don't think that your good answer is going to get answered. Your prayers will get answered. And Lucretius writes this book on the nature of things and explains that the soul arises from and dies with the body. So that's the first time I saw that concept. The skeptics go even further and say, well, we can't really know anything for certain. That's not really very helpful, but they question everything and they go, I think, a little bit too far. One of his famous quotes of Carneades, which I really like to hear, is this idea that if God's greatest gift to man is his reason, then why does he distribute it so unequally? Again, Epicurus had this concept that if God wants to stop evil, but he can't, then he's weak and he's not a god. And if he can, but he doesn't want to, then he's spiteful and he's also not a god. Ecclesiastes is a book in the Bible that also raises lots of doubts. He says God has no plan, no afterlife, so eat, drink, and be merry, and we all return to dust anyway. Now after the Christ times, Judaism and Christianity began to shift their from a point of view of following rights and laws as being more important because they help social cohesion, that being more important than belief, to the idea that achieving heaven through belief is of prime importance. And this really indicates that doubt is common. So they had to sort of change their tactic to making sure that you believe is more important than actually necessarily doing good deeds and things. So there's this long-range dichotomy, long-term dichotomy between those who follow religion just for the purpose of having social cohesion, and in their own mind they don't really believe, to those who follow belief as the primary important step. And there's always this battle between the two. Judaism reversed sort of this concept in the 1800s, where they went back to the idea that having the social cohesion is more important than actual belief in a deity. So after this time, the Greek philosophies are generally considered secular and anti-religious, even though the followers often participated in these religious worship and rites, again, done for the sake of community cohesion. And these Greek philosophies found the philosophy at that time was then considered similar to atheism. Found the God in the beauty of nature and harmony, so it's a naturalistic God rather than a personal creator God. Like a quote from Seneca: "Religion is regarded by the common people as true, the wise as false, and by rulers as useless." And now we're in the Common Era. Alicia Ben Abuya is excommunicated from Judaism for atheism, again saying there's neither justice nor a judge. Gnosticism, I'm not that familiar with this, but one key point they made is they've sort of solved the problem of evil by defining two gods. One is a creator God who's to be despised because he imprisoned humans in this sort of uncaring world. You know, the universe is just out there. There's no purpose. There's no meaning. You're going to suffer whatever comes along. Whereas then and he's the one that's accessible because he impacts our daily lives. And then there's this higher God who's just outside the universe and who's the source of all humaneness and loving feelings and all. And he's the one that we should be revering, but we can't really access him because he's outside the universe. So that's sort of their way of solving the problem of evil. There's all this evil, but it's not created by the God that we love. It's created by some other source. The end of the Roman Empire, Manichaeism and Augustine infused Christianity with this Eastern asceticism, sort of giving up the idea of giving up worldly pleasures to reach heaven. The word monk is derived from Manichaeism. And let me see. We now arrive into sort of a dark age of doubt, which I'll explain a little bit better on the next slide, but this fellow Boethius writes the consolation of philosophy, keeping sort of a thin thread of doubt throughout this period. There were periods of Islamic doubt. Islam started around 700 CE, and there were various groups that did not really like the idea. So there's the whole circle of free thinkers and heretics, some of them being executed for their proclaiming that there is no creator and that the world was eternal. Then Ibn al-Rawandi writes the Book of Emerald and another one called Against the Quran, refuting Islam. And he's one of the first guys who at least documents disputing the miracles of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Muhammad mocks them as religions and liars and said the Quran's full of contradictions and absurdities. And we can know the world through science and observation, not prophets. This fellow Al-Razi was a famous Iranian physician around 900 CE. He also writes a book on the prophet's fraudulent tricks, stratagems of those who claim to be prophets, and refutes the revealed religion. One of the proofs of God was supposedly the beauty of how well the Quran was written. He says that's bunk. And raises the concept that the fact that so many different religions exist suggests that none of them are correct. Later on, another movement, the Falsafa movement, which not completely atheist, but describes the meaning of life through science and math and rejects the Quran's creationism. As you can see, much of this discussion here revolves around Western religion, probably just because we have the best documentation of that, although there's certainly doubt periods in Asia and China and Japan, and probably in the Americas, Africa and the Americas as well. Let me see. I'm going to skip to the next slide here, which and then go back to that one. There's a period of doubt suppression around this time of 1400 to 1800, and Jennifer Hecht describes this sort of as a movement of doubt around the Mediterranean, back up until around 400 CE. The Greek religions were revered, the Greek philosophies were revered and accepted, but around this time, they start getting more, I guess, adamant or less free thinking. So the Christian religion, really, the Catholics really took over thought. And this famous teacher, well beloved teacher, Hypatia, was murdered. She happened to be living in Alexandria at the time. This represented sort of the end of tolerance of doubt and philosophies in the Roman Empire, at least the Western Roman Empire. So then these schools of philosophy opened up or continued in the Eastern Empire around Constantinople area, and that allowed the free thinking to continue in that area. But that also eventually got drowned out by the Roman Empire, and the philosophy schools closed, and the tolerance kind of moved to Syria and Persia. And I already mentioned this fellow Al-Razi in Iran, who wrote several books about counteracting Islam and talking about science and medicine. So the Arabs then began to invite back to Alexandria the scholars. So there was this heyday of growth of astronomy and medicine, math, etc., in the great libraries of Alexandria. And then this sort of moved, yes. During this time, as I already mentioned, the Zondaqua and the Falsafa movements kept this doubt concepts and histories of the Greek philosophers alive. He kept chasing the fundamentalist religious kept sort of chasing this doubt clockwise around the Mediterranean. Then it spread across North Africa. This famous philosopher, Averroes, born actually in Cordoba, Spain, but studied and taught in Morocco, so moved the spread of Arabian rationalism into Spain. He lived around 1850 CE. In Spain, the Jews transformed rationalism. A famous Jewish thinker, Maimonides, helps transform rationalism and keeping the Aristotelian philosophy alive. And then by the 1200s, or after the 1200s, the Christians start bringing rationalism and science back to Europe, sort of in time for the Renaissance. So Averroes, listed here, is known as the great commentator on Aristotle, saying things like demonstrated facts, and the Quran must be taken as an allegory rather than literally. So now I'm going to go back to this. Just summarizes some of these things. As I mentioned, there was doubt in Asia. Confucian Zhu Li teaches the soul and consciousness arise from the body and disappear when the body disintegrates. Not the first time we've heard that idea, but his teachings remain influential in China for some 600 years. Already mentioned Maimonides. Also, people need religion for political and emotional purposes, but not for practical purposes. Here's an interesting story, the condemnation of 1277. Bishop Tempier in France writes a list of 219 forbidden statements and ideologies that contradict church dogma. And so the need for this kind of a list really demonstrates that doubt was abundant. So doubt in France is pretty long-term and pretty strong. Nicholas of Rochefort burn all his writings on skepticism. Again, that's why we're missing a lot of this information. A lot of it was destroyed. Even theologians write that all effects, even surprising ones, have natural causes, and there's no reason to take recourse to the heavens, the last refuge of the weak. Again, in Japan, in Asia, we find the Japanese Zen master stating that we all end the same way with no afterlife. Then in the Enlightenment period, this professor Pietro Panazzi is a famous atheist who again mentions that souls only exist in living bodies and no afterlife. And here's a new concept that people don't need threats of heaven versus hell to act morally, noting that even animals act virtuously. So he's sort of one of the first to point out that there is a biological source for morality, which I thought was very interesting, given the books now by Franz de Waal, who've really expanded that concept. And again, the different religions all claim different moralities, so they're all likely wrong. And I think this is a new idea also, that morality is not constant; it's changing with societies and time. So there's no such thing as absolute morality. We already went through this. 1497, Gabriela de Salo is tried in Bologna for claiming that Christ's miracles were natural. 1513, Machiavelli writes The Prince, describing how morality does not correlate with success, that evil-minded men control the religious and the promise of paradise. So you don't, to lead your army, you don't necessarily need to do everything morally. You need to watch out for these evil-minded men because they will control you in ways that you don't like. Well, interestingly, the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre in 1572 was sort of a culmination of boiling over fights between the Catholics and Protestants, whether truth relies on you doing good deeds during your life, or whether you need to, all you need to do is accept God before you die, or accept Jesus before you die. And so during this time of several thousand Catholics and Protestants during this one day, kill each other, which is more than were persecuted in the entire history of the Roman Empire. So they're quite capable of each other. They don't need other people. There's an argument that we've never seen a dead man return from the other world to tell us that paradise exists. All of these stories are fantasies from friars and priests who want to live without working and pamper themselves on the goods of the church. So then we see some of these more atheists, Alvis Capuano, repeating some of the older ideas that when the body dies, the soul dies, humans don't exist. So we're starting to get a lot of this repetition of much older ideas. Pinocchio was executed for atheism, claiming that there's no virgin birth, and that even that other cultures are just as virtuous and moral without ever having heard about God or the Bible. Of course, even early humans were moral and virtuous to us long before any religious texts were written. And even the Neanderthals there's evidence of Neanderthals born or dying of in an old age, even though they were disabled. They could tell that from the bone structure, and thus would have been a burden on society, and yet they were taken care of. So they certainly had morals long before any of these religious books were written. Montaigne inspired the Levantine skeptics that held irreligious discussions and retreats in the early 1600s. In 1601, Montaigne's protege Pierre Charon published this book, Wisdom, and immediately put on the list of forbidden books. But it clearly spells out for the first time the notion that doubt can be a place of freedom, happiness, and security. So contrary to the religious idea that you're insecure, you're free roaming, you're ungrounded if you don't have religion, he turns this around and pointing out that this can be a place of happiness and security. Vanini's 1619 burned at the stake for joking about creationism, and writing that the religions are humans' fictions cooked up by kings and clergy for the sake of power. By the 1620s, it was claimed that 50,000 out of 100,000 Parisians are atheists. And then famously in 1633, Galileo is tried for heretically teaching that the sun does not move around the Earth, but rather the Earth moves around the sun. Conform the scriptures to the science, but of course, does not think that the Bible should be interpreted literally. So here's a cute little image of Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600, Vanini 1619. Some atheists use 1600 as the first year and count the years starting from then in honor of Bruno, who was a priest to begin with. Here's an image of Galileo in front of the court. Now we come to the 30 Years' War, which I think is an important time point because the St. Bartholomew Day massacre was part of that. It was a religious war, predominantly between Catholics and Protestants. And then the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus swept down, took over, and told everyone, okay, I'm now king. You can keep your religion, just keep it private. And this sort of begins the concept of separation of church and state. The religious wars continue in the Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, and to this day, the Muslim areas haven't really had this kind of reckoning. But this was the beginning of this separation. After this, the wars were primarily in Western Europe or in the West were conducted between nation states, where the nation loyalty dominated over the religious loyalty. So that separation started a long time ago, long before the Declaration of Independence or any of the American ideas. Spinoza was a Jewish thinker who was excommunicated because espousing all his ideas that God is equivalent to nature, and even suggested there's a lack of free will since everything's controlled by our biochemistry. This, of course, famously later on, this is what Einstein says, that he believes in the God of Spinoza, that God is just an equivalent name for nature, and there's no separate soul in the body and no afterward. I will skip over some of these because there's, at this point, it gets to be very lots and lots of people espousing these religious ideas, and you can't go into everyone's thoughts on them. But some famous ones, of course, were Napoleon, who stated again that religious wars are basically people killing each other over who has a better imaginary friend. And when asked what happens when both sides pray for victory in battle, it says, well, God usually picks a side with the better artillery. Of course, important to Americans is how in the late 1700s, the Franklin, Jefferson, Paine infused the Declaration and Constitution with separation of church and state, the Epicurean idea of the pursuit of happiness. And John Adams later on does write as president that the US government is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Now, in the late 1700s, and we have the scientific revolutions. Chemistry, physics, biology medicine are starting to improve. And in the later 1800s, well, actually, go back to France, the Festival of Reason was an aftermath of the French Revolution, which was primarily conducted because the Catholic Church was gaining so much wealth, that they tore down the churches, seized their assets, and they replaced the calendar with a secular one, and installed the first state-sponsored atheism as a state-sponsored religion. Unfortunately, it lasted only 1 year, but they had this festival of reason, and this is supposed to be the goddess of reason. Seems like kind of an oxymoron, but the point was not that she was a real god, but that we should all be following reason rather than a hypothetical mystical god. Of course, then we have Charles Darwin coming along, and so there's lots of chemistry, physics, other scientific revolution, and this really inspires a lot of open discussions on these. So it was a time when people they didn't have television or anything. They might have had theater, but they would go to lectures and evening talks, and it was, especially in places like New York City, there was a vibrant communities that met and discussed the new findings on science. And so by the early 1900s, it was actually thought that religion was out the door. John Stuart Mills notes that he's one of the new generation that did not lose religion, but never even had it to begin with. And then here's a list of other notable atheists. Judaism, I mentioned earlier, Judaism was reformed to reduce the importance of supernatural belief in favor of cultural traditions. And Newport Royal became the first person to lobby the US Congress for the separation of church and state. Annie Wright converts a New York City Baptist church to a hall of science with their weekly lectures. And secularism continues in France. Harriet Martineau was an influential writer and abolitionist and promoted writing of children's books to help secular parents raise their children without religion. Calls Christianity a decaying mythology. Clinging to a man god as a scheme for salvation is utterly repugnant to my faculties. Karl Marx and Feuerbach introduced an important concept that religion is needed when societal conditions are poor and there's not much people can do to improve their lot. So they reach out to an imaginary friend to help them out. But if we can improve society enough that the health and poverty and food sources are abundant, then the need for religion no longer exists, and thus atheism is a good goal. And this is sort of the idea on which Lenin and later on started communism, with that idea that atheism is the goal we're looking for, because then we no longer need the support of religion. Another writer, Ludwig Buchner, indicates these ideas that thoughts are merely biophysical processes, etc. Charles Darwin, already mentioned. Thomas Huxley coined the term agnosticism, and he really pushed Darwin's ideas. Darwin was never completely an avowed atheist, but held to evolution as dismantling of creationism. Friedrich Nietzsche came along in the late 1800s, stating that God is dead, by which he meant that people needed a rid themselves of controlling religion to fulfill their own human potential. I'll move on. Charles Bradlaugh helps found Free Thought International and writes that atheists don't deny God, but rather, and this is a new concept, they can't conceive of God because not even believers can give a clear definition. So that's one of the difficulties in combating God or the concept of God, because you don't always know what you're exactly arguing against. Again, Lenin creates the first nation in the Russian Revolution that is decidedly hostile towards religion. And then in the early 1800s, we have many authors like Mark Twain who believed, well, he believes in a natural God, but writes scathing essays denying the existence of moral God. Some of these quotes here: the best cure for Christianity is reading the Bible, and no amount of evidence will ever persuade an idiot. He looks a lot like Einstein here. That was interesting. Oops. And then this interesting quote from Edison, not exactly a quote, paraphrasing. He was an atheist and says he's the one who really let there be light. Then we're into the 1900s. Hubert Harrison was the Black Socrates, leads African Americans into a period of creativity. This is mostly in New York City, of arts and philosophy and views with thought. In 1923, Ataturk comes to power and quickly secularizes Turkey and abolishes the caliphate. Unfortunately, that has turned back into a little bit more religious lately. Here's an interesting new concept from Freud, that religion is a willful self-deception by the human subconscious to find a measure of security, control over life's hardships, unpredictability, and the forces of nature. So willful self-deception, that's sort of the new idea, which has been discussed further by Robert Trivers at Rutgers University. I guess he's moved on from there. But he thinks that humanity will mature and grow out of this need, that we'll be able to find that security in atheism or a secular world. Mao Zedong leads to communist China with the Marx-Leninist ideas. Religion is bad for the state and draining workers of energy and reality. And the famous doubter Bertrand Russell writes the book, Why I'm Not the essay Why I'm Not a Christian, wins a Nobel Prize for Literature. There's a bunch of these. There's a trilogy, not necessarily connected on purpose, but Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian, Ibn Warraq, 1995, Why I'm Not a Muslim, Ramendra Nath in 2011, Why I'm Not a Hindu. Moving on. Then there was the existentialists, the Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus. Says that because there is no purpose in life, that we are free and happy to make our own, and without religion. The 60s, there's a Zen Buddhism revival in the West. Again, different types of Buddhisms are somewhat theistic. In the 50s to 80s, Madeleine O'Hare. Yeah, okay, this is the point here. During the Cold War, the atheism was equated with communism. And so God references were added to our currency and the Pledge of Allegiance. And Madeleine O'Hare fights this idea, wins a lawsuit to ban compulsory prayer in schools, and founds the American Atheists. 1973, Peter Stark becomes the first openly atheist member of Congress. And then in the 80s, there's a rising wave of Islamic extremism. And some of these authors who originated from that area sort of are lament that politicians and intellectuals are trying to protect Islam. So remember when there was a ban on travel from Islamic countries, people say, well, it's not Islam. We need to battle. It's not, it's just these extremists. But these authors coming from that region actually saying, well, it is about Islam, that Islam has that in it of saying that it's some of its fundamental premises are to try to take over the world and not make it a capital punishment to leave the religion. And then we come to the modern history, the Four Horsemen of Richard Dawkins and the new atheist movement, led by Harrison, Hitchens, and Dawkins and Bennett. And finally, Franz de Waal. To me, this one's important. Publishes Bonobo and the Atheist, documenting the biological origins of morality. So, okay, why am I not moving? Here we go. Salman Rushdie in 1988 told a story of that it was threatened with writing the satanic verses. He tells a story about at age 15, he ate a ham sandwich, which was forbidden, and he noted that no thunderbolt struck him down, and realized that a lot of these stuff is bulk. Satanic verses, the actual verses aren't really anti-religious, but it was used as a means for attacking him. And I guess we all know that just a few weeks ago, he was attacked on stage, after coming out of hiding, and I believe has lost one eye. So those threats from religious are still there. And now there's any number of atheists that we can mention, famous atheists. I won't try to read them all, but just give you an example of some of the famous actors, and not so many politicians, but a lot of public figures, artists and religious and musicians. So to summarize, I'd say doubt and atheism have a long and widespread history. It's not just something that came up since Dawkins or even the scientific revolution, but even long before the scientific revolution. Then most of the well-known arguments against the existence of gods were made by the ancient Greeks, if not earlier. Only those requiring modern science could be made later. And then I'd add a word of caution that just as skeptics of religion are common because their tenets are not obvious in daily life, there will also always be skeptics of science because facts and complex concepts are often difficult to prove. For example, the existence of atoms, microorganisms, a spherical Earth even, or in distant galaxies, they're not really visible to the naked eye. They require special tools to see. And so when it's not obviously in front of you, it's easy to believe and make something up, even if especially when you hear a nice story contrary to the scientific evidence, because stories are one way that humans believe things readily. Things like evolution and climate change require a long-term study. So even if climate change is occurring and we can see it, it's not something that you can tell from one day to the next as being obviously happening. So with that, I guess I will stop my share and turn it back over to the host. And thank you for your attention. Can't hear you clapping. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Werner. I found a lot of interesting stuff there,
Mm.
and a lot of things I just thought were just kind of neat. I like the idea that just some of the quotes, like there are two kinds of people: those who want to know and those who want to believe.
Mhm.
That seems fairly accurate. My impression of the Jains was that they don't even believe in an afterlife. Is that correct? The Jains?
Oh, Jains. I don't know the answer.
Okay.
Yeah, someone else help me here.
Yeah, I remember reading something about it. There are a lot of restrictions, but I knew someone who was a Jain, and he clearly wasn't following all the restrictions, like most people. When I'm asked, I like to tell people I don't think a person made or controls the universe with his magic powers. And people tell me that's not what they believe in, what they mean by God, but they're not really, don't seem prepared to tell me what they do believe.
Right. Yeah. As I said, that's often the problem, getting a clear definition
Undefined.
of what God is. Yeah.
And my chief objection to religion, I suppose, is that there's so many people who think this is something you're supposed to believe because I said so, or
just by default, or
it's written here in this book.
And they imagine that somehow there was no morality before the book was written.
Yeah.
I mean, this question actually came up on the Quora discussions. What did people do before the Bible was written?
How do you get them to behave without threats and promises?
I mean, they really think that hunter-gatherers had no sense of community, or I mean, there was food sharing going on. There's, like I said, Neanderthals took care of their disabled people into later life. They had to cooperate and not long for any kind of religious declaration.
Yeah, I think none of us are really quite as self-sacrificing as our dogs probably are.
And then just a sense of fairness. That's something. I mean, look at the stuff from Franz de Waal, who describes ape societies, bonobos and chimpanzees and gorillas who have quite a sense of fairness and compassion and even altruism, where it's been known that male chimpanzees take care of orphaned small chimpanzees for several years in the wild.
Jax, I see your hand up.
I was just going to comment that I liked this idea that, at least in modern atheism, that this idea that we can move beyond simply and
enduring lack of religion, but thinking of it as something positive.
Right, like the idea of, yeah, I mean, I know the humanists promote this. Obviously, that's huge what the humanists do, but because my first instinct when I saw one of the, that the woman that was really promoting separation of church and state was like, yeah, why aren't we working to get God taken off money or taken off out of the Pledge of Allegiance and stuff? And so it's complicated to wonder, where is sort of our role now? Like, there's a lot. I
thought about that.
Lots of roles. So
I thought about that some. I mean, where do atheists go? And as president of ACSJ, I'm always trying to find a focus for our group, and it sort of gets old to be just the group that says, well, we're against religion, right? So where are we going forward? And I think I just find it in getting involved in community, I mean, I coach sports, getting involved in other, I'd like to have community groups that get involved in volunteerism and that sort of thing. But also as an individual, not everybody can afford that time and effort. So it's just whatever your hobby it is. If you're if you're a bridge club organizer or whatever it is that gets you excited, if you're a musician, be happy to organize your orchestra or your band or whatever it is. So I think that's where we find our purpose. We make our own purpose that way. And if you're, so basically that's the idea. Whatever it is that floats your boat, get excited about it, enjoy it, put your energy and effort into it, help your family, take care of your health, eat well, and enjoy life.
Okay, Lester.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I would like to point out once again that the invention of gods was a direct result of the invention of human speech. When people started chatting with each other about all kinds of things, and that was an invention of the hunter-gatherers. In particular, one African tribe called Homo sapiens invented human speech and got the whole thing started. And that led to piles of baloney that we are talking about today. But it all goes back to that single invention of human speech, which caused all of this baloney to be put together. And well, that's just the beginning of the story. I've told it on my webpage. And
so Lester, I would answer that by saying, yes, I agree essentially, but it does depend a bit on how you define religion or gods. It's known that apes will revere their dead for a while. So they'll, an example by Frans de Waal was one of the groups in the chimpanzee clan died, and they brought them in front of the group, and they all stopped and bowed, sort of, or had a moment of silence. Elephants will visit the bones of their dead, and they'll come back to them for years, even knowing the location. They'll take a few minutes to stop and take their trunks and sort of touch the old bones. Even are known to, if they find one of their dead, to sort of briefly gather around. Each one of them takes a little twig and places it on top of the body, and then they disappear. It may only last a few minutes, but so if you count that as religion, then this stuff all sort of evolved gradually. So I would argue against a single time point or event point in the beginning of religion, because there's sort of all this various gradual evolution of abilities and cognitive abilities that sort of lead up to it. Would you agree with that?
no.
No? Okay. Well, sure, we had to tell stories in order to create a god. It's hard to communicate that feature without being able to talk. But I wouldn't say that communication was the only feature that caused it.
It gave us the ability to lie.
Yeah.
Oded,
Yeah, I have some concern. Being a what called atheist, does it force you to be humanist, to treat other people with human treatment? I don't think I heard anything about that. That means they say no God, but do they have some positive, which is you force people to do charity? I don't hear it. Some religious will force it by law, kind of. Some, that is, I don't see it. I don't hear about that.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. This talk was
Being an
just,
atheist, like a belief, does it force you to do charity, to help poor people? By force, by law,
well,
not by
no,
volunteer.
no, of
No.
course it doesn't, no.
So
I mean,
being humanist and being atheist not connected.
oh, of course they're connected. They're very connected. I mean,
It's not
humanists don't have laws that require you to help other people either, but they just feel that that's the best thing to do. This talk was about the history of atheism and doubt about religion, not so much what those people who doubt that religion then go on to do. But as you can see, a lot of the doubters talked about doing good things and helping other people and living good lives.
Yeah, like in China, everyone there atheist, but there's no any law that you have to get any charity. So in Russia, everyone for himself, basically.
Yes, but it's a natural thing for humans to take care of each other and to help each other and feel compassion. Do we need laws for that? Well, we have our secular governments to handle those situations. And we have a lot of volunteer organizations that people can participate in. I mean, atheism doesn't say anything about that directly, but I would venture to say that most atheists are also humanists. But Alex, you guys don't have any rules in your group that say, well, if you join our humanist community, you must contribute this and this much to some philanthropy, do you?
no, but I think we kind of define humanism as a concern about human welfare of
Yeah,
Sure, that's important, of course. This talk wasn't really about that,
right.
but I agree it's an important thing that we should talk about and we should do.
should do, not talk about. Talking is easy.
Well,
In Arabic, you say,
okay.
Several people have their hands up and are not being called on.
okay, sorry, I took the up.
Yeah.
Ray,
You're muted, Ray.
I'd just like to comment on Lester's comment that, while the invention of speech facilitated creation of religions, invention of speech also had a lot of good aspects to it too.
Yeah. And it also created the ability to be an atheist.
And the ability to be a humanist.
Right.
okay, Zem,
Yeah, thanks for the talk.
Sure.
One thing that occurred to me, you gave a history of religion as essentially a belief in some supernatural force that sort of orders our universe and gives an explanation for the the sort of infinite complexity of the world, or injustices, like you said, inequities. But I guess what I would argue and sort of ask you about is secular religions that we have developed over the past couple of centuries. The biggest such religion is Marxism. Marxism is a religion. It's a set of beliefs that people hold about social structure and how societies form, and they believe it without proof. It's a religion. People are very fervent about it. Another religion I can think of is Freudianism, the notion of psychoanalysis, which every psychologist and psychiatrist I think on the planet has debunked by now, and yet people adhere to it because it has a nice sort of pseudo-intellectual structure, just like Marxism. Another one I could think of is objectivism. The people who follow Ayn Rand and sort of there's this libertarian notion, right, which is in some ways opposed to Marxism, but it's also a religion. It's fervently believed by its adherents. And finally, humanism is a religion. We have beliefs about how we should treat one another and what course of actions our life should take, and it's also really presented without any scientific proof, right? And then you have sort of the mini religions, I would call it, namely conspiracy theories like QAnon and things like that. Again, people need to have some sort of a belief in the world as to why things are happening the way they are. So they create these notions of these dark conspiracies against them. And so you have you have your George Soros, you have your Illuminati, there's just tons of them, right? And there are also systems of thought that are presented to you without proof. So I would argue that we're still very religious as a species. It's just no longer sort of a supernatural element to it. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, so I'm not sure if there's a question in there, but I would go further and say that even science is a religion, if you want to use that type of an argument, because I don't have any obvious proof that atoms exist. I believe what the other scientists have told me, about the origins of the universe and the Big Bang and relativistic theory. I don't really understand it, and there's very little. Everything we do goes on our past beliefs of what people have told us, and so we cannot live our lives trying to get 100% certainty on all these things and research all these things. We need to make decisions based on incomplete information. So we have to just believe what has been told to us. Now, as a scientist, I've been involved in reviewing a lot of scientific papers and research proposals. If someone's proposing to do a certain amount of work, a certain type of work, and they want $100,000, or $200,000 for it to do their research, well, I have to trust to some extent in what they say the past researchers have found in this area and how they're going to improve that state of knowledge, and hopefully improve the world by doing this research. And I trust them based on the fact that I trust the scientific process, that there's a lot of vetting going on, there's peer review, there's discussion. But ultimately, if this guy has a good name and what he says sounds reasonable, and he's using references of past work of people that seem reputable and have some of their things have proven to be practically useful and observable, then I will believe them. But there's a lot of sort of faith going on. This is what the scientists say often about, the religious people say, oh, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, right? So they don't understand evolution. It's too complex for them, or they don't understand psychology or whatever it is. So they feel that it needs a lot of faith. Whereas a scientist will look at that and say, well, okay, here's all this literature supporting this back to here, and there's a big chain that we understand and we believe. And only in the long run does it prove to be true. So, for example, relativistic theory. I don't have any personal experience with it, but I'm told that our GPS systems don't work quite very well unless we include relativistic effects on the travel of the radio waves back to the Earth. And once that's taken into account, then the GPS becomes much more accurate. So there's sort of a belief in relativistic theory, physics, that has ultimately sort of proven to be useful. Still, I just
Well, but
believe it.
the situation you're describing is, not just a belief in shared reality, but the ability to observe it. If you have if you run a scientific experiment and someone in North Korea runs the same experiment, you should have very similar answers, regardless of your religious beliefs or right there. There's a shared objective reality that you're looking at.
Yeah.
So would you say that atheism is really the lack of a belief in a supernatural? Is that sort of the more narrow definition?
Well, it's a lack of belief in gods as the narrative. Yeah, I suppose the supernatural falls into that. But as we said, it's so hard to define God. Then it's hard to define what you don't believe in. So yes, we need all those kind of belief systems that you've mentioned several that are alternative belief systems. They're probably better than religious ones because the so-called religion belief in God, turn out not to be very practical and can cause damage. So,
well, Marxism has caused more damage, I would argue,
sure,
than any religion.
Yeah, we need to think about all these things and find the best route.
Danessa.
Hi, thank you. Whoop. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Danessa.
I was just thinking back about the invention of religion. Two things that I think contributed obviously to the invention of religion is the ability to imagine things and scenarios that are not there, that are not present. And we know that apes can do that as well as humans.
Yes.
So I can see where animals, higher thinking animals like apes and dogs or whatever, in pain to soothe themselves, somehow go to something that they clearly know is gone for comfort, in almost what would appear is like a ritual. So, but more than that, I think that man's ability, to simplify and organize and categorize and problem solve the things that really set, Homo sapiens apart, has been instrumental for our survival. Hence, we have this innate tendency, which has helped us survive, to want to explain all the occurrences in nature and explain cause and effect around us. We want to make sense out of everything. And where we don't have the technology or methodology to explain events, we create one. Because we're problem solvers, we're survivals, and we want to, if we can explain it or find the reasons, then we can control it, right? So I think we kind of naturally gravitated to fabricating such explanations through gods, superstitions, whatever, as a survival mechanism. And also, emotionally, we're emotional beings to deal with the incredible anxiety and fear. that we had of not knowing, why is it flooding? Why do we have no water? Why aren't we killing any animals? Where did they go? So let's go draw a horse on a cave wall in France, right? And hope that one will show up, right? So to me, I think that it kind of came about as an emotional crutch, and just out of a natural tendency to try to explain the world around us. So, but we know different now.
We know different now.
Definitely now. Yes.
Why do you say that? I mean, I think all those things are
No, we know
important.
differently now that, we don't have to, yeah, that praying isn't going to, yeah,
Right, yeah.
no
Yeah.
one's going to hear us but the wall. Yeah.
I agree with all those things. And the other argument sometimes has been, well, the world is made uniquely. Humans fit into this world so well. All the food and water is there for us. We must have been created. And the analogy was that there's this pond, this puddle, waking up one day into consciousness and looking around itself and finding that the hole it's in fits him exactly. And so the puddle says, well, gee, look at this hole. It fits me exactly. It must be created just for me.
That's great.
So of course, we evolved into this situation we're in, and because it was there pre-existing. Yeah.
Thanks, Werner.
Mhm.